All right, now let's go to the UK, where Keir Starmer, Prime Minister, is speaking on funding and supporting Ukraine right now. Let's go live.
But I do want to be crystal clear. We must strengthen our relationship with America. For our security, for our technology, for our trade and investment. They are and always will be indispensable. And we will never choose between either side of the Atlantic. In fact, Mr. Speaker, if anything, the past week has shown that that idea is totally unserious. Because while some people may enjoy the simplicity of taking a side, this week has shown with total clarity that the US is vital in securing the peace we all want to see in Ukraine. So I welcome the opportunity for a new economic deal with the US, confirmed by the President last week, because it's an opportunity I'm determined to pursue. I welcome the positive discussions we had on European security, including his clear support for Article 5 of NATO. I welcome the understanding from our dialogue that our two nations will work together on security arrangements for a lasting peace in Ukraine. I also welcome the President's continued commitment to that peace, which nobody in this House should doubt for a second is sincere. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the events of this weekend and the moving scenes that greeted President Zelensky as he arrived in London on Saturday. Mr. Speaker, I saw for myself he was taken aback when the crowd in Whitehall cheered at the top of their voices, and they were speaking for the whole of our country. A reminder that this government, this House and this nation stand in unwavering support behind him and the people of Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, we resolved together to move forward the strong cause of just and lasting peace in Ukraine. And then on Sunday, I hosted European leaders from across our continent, equally committed to this cause, including President Macron, Prime Minister Meloni, the leaders of NATO, the European Commission and Council, and the Prime Minister of Canada, a vital ally of this country, the Commonwealth and Ukraine, responsible for training over 40,000 Ukrainian troops. I also had the privilege beforehand of speaking online to the leaders of Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia, each of whom, as close as they are to the front line with Russia, stressed the urgency of the moment. And, Mr. Speaker, it was a productive summit. Together we agreed a clear strategy that the United Kingdom, France and our allies will work closely with Ukraine on a plan to stop the fighting, which we will then discuss directly with the United States. It's a plan that has 4 clear principles, which I'll now share in full with the House. First, that we must keep the military aid to Ukraine flowing, keep increasing the economic pressure on Russia, and to that end, alongside our partnership on air defence, we're doubling down on military aid. Already this year, we've taken our support to record levels. But on Saturday, we also agreed a new £2.2 billion loan for Ukraine, backed not by the British taxpayer, but by the profits from frozen Russian assets. Second, Mr. Speaker, we agreed that any lasting peace must guarantee the sovereignty and security of Ukraine, and that Ukraine must be at the table when negotiating their future. That is absolutely vital. Third, we agreed that in the event of a peace deal, we will continue to boost Ukraine's defences and Ukraine's deterrence. And finally, fourth, we agreed to develop a coalition of the willing, ready to defend a deal in Ukraine and guarantee the peace. Mr. Speaker, after all, the Ukrainian position is completely understandable. For them, the war did not begin 3 years ago. That was merely the latest and most brutal escalation. They have signed agreements with Putin before. They've experienced the nature of his diplomacy and the calibre of his word. We cannot accept a weak deal like Minsk again. No, we must proceed with strength, and that does now require urgently a coalition of the willing. Mr. Speaker, we agreed on Sunday that those willing to play a role in this will intensify planning now. And as this House would expect, Britain will play a leading role, with, if necessary, and together with others, boots on the ground and planes in the air. Mr. Speaker, it is right that Europe do the heavy lifting to support peace on our continent. But to succeed, this effort must also have strong US backing. I want to assure this House I take none of this lightly. I've visited British troops in Estonia, and no aspect of my role weighs more heavily than the deployment of British troops in the service of defence and security in Europe. And yet I do feel very strongly that the future of Ukraine is vital for our national security. Russia is a menace in our waters and skies. They've launched cyber attacks on our NHS, assassination attempts in our streets. In this House, we stand by Ukraine because it's the right thing to do. But we also stand by them because it's in our interest to do so. Because if we do not achieve a lasting peace, then the instability and insecurity that has hit the living standards of working people in Britain, that will only get worse. And Putin's appetite for conflict and chaos, that will only grow. So a strong peace, a just peace, a lasting peace, that has now to be our goal. It is vital, it is in our interests, and its pursuit, Britain will lead from the front for the security of our continent, the security of our country, and the security of the British people. We must now win the peace. And I commend this statement to the House.
I come to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Bedrock.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement and also for our conversation earlier today. The United Kingdom is a free, democratic and sovereign country. We recognise that Ukraine is fighting for her survival and fighting to have the same freedom, democracy and sovereignty which all of us here enjoy. That is why both the opposition and the government are fully committed to supporting Ukraine and President Zelensky. I was also glad to see His Majesty the King welcome President Zelensky at Sandringham. As I said at the weekend, President Zelensky is a hero. He is a symbol of the bravery of the Ukrainian people. There are, of course, many areas where the Prime Minister and I disagree, but now is the time for us to discuss where we do agree. I welcome all of his actions this weekend to convene European leaders, as well as the focus on economic security using UK export finance to support British jobs. As the Prime Minister knows, we welcomed the uplift in defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. We also support the use of foreign aid to achieve this. We welcome a commitment to reach 3% in the years ahead, and we will support him in taking difficult spending decisions, including on welfare. And we will return to the details of how the government will fund this in the near future. But for now, it is right that the Prime Minister is working with allies in Europe and with the United States to bring peace to Ukraine and not a surrender to Russia. As part of this, the Prime Minister has suggested that British troops could be deployed in Ukraine. There are obviously a range of possible options for what such a deployment could look like, and we are keen to work with the government, but we will need details of any such plan. This will be a difficult but significant step. I know many in Parliament and across our country will be interested in what this entails, and I ask him to work with us so there can be effective scrutiny. I also welcome the coalition of the willing to support Ukraine and agree that Europe must do the heavy lifting. So can I ask the Prime Minister to update us on what European and other allies are willing to offer towards this coalition? Can I welcome the use of the proceeds from frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine, and ask the Prime Minister if he has plans to go further and use the frozen assets themselves? Can I ask him for an update on the government's sanctions on Russian-linked individuals, and for confirmation that such sanctions would not be lifted in the event of a ceasefire? Can I ask the Prime Minister to update us on the steps he and other allies are taking to ensure that Ukraine is at the negotiating table for any peace plan, and what he thinks can be done to heal the rift with Washington? As the Prime Minister referenced in his speech, the Minsk agreements of 2015 failed to stop Russian aggression and ultimately did not return Ukraine's territorial integrity. His second principle is that any lasting peace guarantees the sovereignty of Ukraine. So can I finally ask how the Prime Minister will work to ensure we avoid a repeat of the Minsk agreements, and how we can ensure that any peace fully protects Ukrainian sovereignty? At times like these, it is so important that we stand together to defend shared values and the fundamental, basic principle that aggressors should not win. The Prime Minister will have our support to do that, and to ensure that we continue to uphold those values all of us in this Parliament hold dear.
Prime Minister.
Can I thank her for her message in our discussion this morning? And can I thank the Leader of the Opposition for her support for the measures that we are taking? It matters across this House that we are united on this issue. It matters to the Ukrainians and to President Zelensky. And I can tell you that he was moved by the reception that he got in our country on Saturday. And I can tell you I felt very proud to be British on Saturday when our country spoke with one voice, and she reflects that with the unity across the House, and I do thank her for it. She asks about the details of any deployment. We will, of course, put details before the House when we get to that stage, if we get to that stage. And as I mentioned to her this morning in our phone call, I will make sure that she gets whatever briefings she needs to be able to look at the detail before it's put before the House, so she's fully informed. On the question of other allies, we had a long meeting yesterday with a number of allies. My strong view is that we have to move forward, we have to lead from the front, and therefore we need a coalition of the willing, because otherwise we will move at the speed of the most reluctant, and that will be too slow. A number of countries and allies indicated their support. They will set that out in due course. I won't pretend that every country is in the same place on this issue. That is why I and others took the view that we should take a leading position and move forward. But I will give further details as they become available. On the question of the frozen assets themselves, obviously the proceeds, the profits, are being used in the way that the House understands in accordance with the statement I just made. On the assets themselves, it is a very complicated issue, not straightforward. But I do think that we need to do and are doing more work to look at what are the possibilities, at least, along with other countries. But I'm not going to pretend that this is simple or straightforward. On the sanctions, we introduced the heaviest sanctions last week that we've put in place, and she is quite right. They must not be lifted just because there's a cessation in the fighting. They must be kept in place as a vital part of our armoury, something which didn't happen with Minsk, and she's quite right to say that we have to avoid the mistakes of the past, which is why a security guarantee is so important, a guarantee that we should lead, but needs US backing if it's to act as a proper guarantee. And of course she's right to say Ukraine must be at the table in any discussions about the future of Ukraine, and I think that's a common position across the House. Thank you.
The Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Emily Thornberry. Dame Emily Thornberry.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. We all watched with alarm and distress the scenes from the White House on Friday, but equally were, across the country, extremely grateful that we had a Prime Minister who had such a pitch-perfect response at the weekend. And as he works towards a just peace for Ukraine, he has the support of the whole country in doing so. But here is the question. The Prime Minister said on Laura Kuenssberg on Sunday that following the cuts to the aid budget, that he would go through line by line to ensure that the priorities of Ukraine, Sudan and Gaza were all prioritised in a lasting peace. The difficulty is that after refugee costs, admin costs, the department's commitments and things like the World Bank and the UN are taken into account, it's hard to believe that there will be enough left in the budget to provide meaningful humanitarian support in these priority areas. So does the Prime Minister understand the concern of so many that these cuts could, in fact, in the long term, hobble the very leadership that the Prime Minister has shown this weekend and that he has finally given the world some hope?
Well, I thank her for her question, and it's a very important issue. What I did last week was to announce the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the Cold War, and the circumstances and the context require it. And that decision had to be made, and I was determined that it would be fully funded so the House could see where the money would come from. On the question of overseas aid, I am committed to it. What we will now do is go through line by line the funding and look at our priorities. Of course, Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza are right up there in our priorities. But I also want to work with others and across the House, if we can, at other ways of raising money and finance for development and aid overseas. I saw the President of the World Bank on Friday to have that very discussion and want to have that and mentioned it in my discussions with other countries this weekend, many of whom want to join in attempts to find other ways to leverage money, particularly from the private sector, where states can't do it in the way they might want to just at the moment, and that's the approach that we will take.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement. We were all horrified by Friday's scenes in the Oval Office. President Trump's attack on the brave and dignified President Zelensky left everyone shocked and appalled, except, it seems, the honourable member for Clacton. Nobody else watching those scenes could fail to understand that we've entered a new era, one where the United States prefers to align itself with tyrants like Putin rather than its democratic partners. On these benches, we've supported the Prime Minister's actions and leadership. Britain leading the world, as we have so many times in the past, bringing together Europe and Canada in London to work towards a just peace that guarantees Ukraine's sovereignty and security. But, Mr. Speaker, we need to reduce our dependency on the United States. Because I say with deep regret, I fear that President Trump is not a reliable ally with respect to Russia. And with that regard, did the Prime Minister discuss with our European allies our proposals for a new rearmament bank and for seizing the tens of billions of pounds worth of Russian assets to support Ukraine? And in his conversations with the Canadian Prime Minister, was he clear that we stand with our Commonwealth ally in the face of President Trump's threats?
All right, that, of course, live in Parliament as the UK Parliament, led, of course, by Mr. Keir Starmer of the Labour government, discusses how to support Ukraine with EU partners going forward, and still, of course, reliant on the United States for that support. That's going to do it for the Global Business Report. Do stay tuned to Arise News from all of us. Thanks for watching.